Greetings, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Peace Be Still with Katera Renae. I'm your host, Katera. In today's episode, I will feature some of my favorite and most important self-care tips. I really feel that this is right on time with the new month starting, but I also believe that any time is the perfect time to start implementing self-care into your life. This can be a new month, or even when a new week hits, or just when you feel like you're in a new season in your life. Now, when I think of self-care tips, I really categorize them into different groups. So, spiritual, emotional, physical. But if I were to do that in this episode, I'd probably be talking for hours. So in this episode, for the sake of time, I'll be giving out my top 5 self-care tips that I try to intentionally include in my life in this season. Of course, it's important to note that I can't do all of these things every day or even every week. But I try to remind myself to take what I need when I need it. And in a few months, a different set of tips may actually be more relevant and important to me. And that's okay too. So, tip number 1 would be to wake up early. Now, the term early is all relative to different people. For some people who have really let their sleep schedule slip off track for whatever reason, waking up at 9 or 10 a.m. may be considered early. And that's perfectly okay. If you have an earlier goal than that, but right now it's just physically not possible for you, that's okay too. If you wake up at 12 in the afternoon and you desire to wake up at 7 in the morning, it may be hard to do that in 1 or 2 days. But you have to start somewhere and slowly push yourself each day until you reach your goal. I know that for me, especially in the spring or summer months, waking up at 6 or 7 a.m. is ideal for me. But that's just it. It's really ideal. Does that mean I wake up at that same time every day? No. Probably once or twice a week I wake up that early. I work part-time in the afternoons at a shelter, meaning twice a week, maybe 3 times a week, I don't get home from work until around 11:30 at night. I'm really big on getting 8 hours or more of sleep per night, so some days I don't wake up until a little after 8 a.m. And that's not necessarily what I want or how early I want to be up, but it's what's best for me, and it's what really has to work for now. My basic rule of thumb, though, is to never, ever, ever sleep past 9 a.m. during the week, and so far this summer I've been able to stay true to this. The reason why I prefer waking up earlier in the summer is because the days are so much longer, the sun is out so much longer, and I think in this present time, the sun rises around 5:50 a.m. and it sets around 9 p.m. This leaves so much possibility to be productive throughout the day, and this is possibility that, for many reasons, just isn't there in the winter months. For those of you who don't know, I live in the Midwest in Detroit, so it's cold, snowy, dark, ugly most of the year. Some days it's very hard to drag myself out of bed, but I never regret it because it gives me the opportunity to get a head start on my day and my morning routine, which really centers me and sets the tone for the rest of my day. Additionally, I always end up getting about half of my to-do list done before noon, which is, to me, that's like peak productivity. Anyone who has a busy schedule or aspires to be busy, because being busy is a good thing, or anyone who aspires to be organized has to start waking up earlier. And it's not just waking up earlier and being drowsy, though. You have to wake up early and be ready to take on the day. So that means going to bed early is essential as well. The two really go hand in hand. If you don't take heed to any of the tips on this list, I urge you to start waking up earlier. It's definitely a life changer, and it's an underrated hack to maximum productivity and success. My second tip is to take yourself on self-care dates. It's so important to figure out what you like to do and take yourself out. So I do want to put an emphasis on solo self-care dates. Self-care dates with others are necessary too, but going out by yourself is just as necessary. And I really don't think enough people do this. I feel like we get so caught up in the cycle of working, taking care of others, paying bills, or just the idea of being productive overall that we forget what we like to do to relax and decompress. And I do want to emphasize, when I'm referring to self-care dates, I don't mean running errands or completing tasks outside of your home that must get done. For example, going to the grocery store or going to pick up something from the store that you may need. These are errands and tasks that must get done. They don't count as self-care dates. At least to me, they don't. Real self-care dates are intentional and purposeful. It's when you create space in your week to say, on Friday, I'm pampering myself. I'm getting dressed, I'm taking myself shopping, I'm taking myself to lunch, or I'm taking myself to the bookstore, and then I'm taking myself to lunch, or I'm going to the movies and I'm taking myself to lunch. Notice how for me everything involves lunch because it's not really a day until you top it off with food. Find things that you like to do and then go do them alone. Spending time with yourself outside of school, work, errands, and other means of productivity is essential to your well-being. I'm going to sidetrack a little bit here and say that I always think about how much of an underrated blessing it is to be able to go out in public in complete confidence and comfortability and just be okay. Over 7% of the American population has been diagnosed with social anxiety. And I always like to put an emphasis on the amount of people who have been diagnosed with a condition, because as soon as I hear that, I always automatically think, well, how many people are living undiagnosed? And this is probably because of stigma, misinformation, miseducation, racial barriers, class barriers, and other things like that. I also often think about how many people have developed social anxiety after COVID-19 and quarantine. I know many people are just used to staying inside and have developed an kind of in-home routine that they've stuck with. I believe at first it started with being afraid of contracting COVID-19, but it's kind of developed maybe into the notion of being home is better. I can work from home, have groceries delivered, everything I need is here, I'm comfortable here. And I absolutely agree. Being able to get things done without having to be physically there and being able to work from home is a blessing. And I do also understand that there are people who suffer from real disease, both mental and physical, which limits their ability to go outside. However, for the majority of people who haven't been diagnosed with anything, or who maybe just feel that they're too anxious leaving the house, or they're just extremely comfortable staying in, I want to repeat. Going out, socializing, being around different people, and doing things that you enjoy is essential to your well-being. Better for your well-being than you may even think. You have to push yourself out of your comfort zone in order to grow. So that activity you always wanted to try, but you can't find anybody to go with you, go alone if it's a possibility. And that restaurant you've always wanted to try, but you never find the time to go, make your weekly to-do list and section off a day and time where you can go by yourself. For some people, like myself, solo self-care dates may only be possible once a month or every 2 to 3 weeks. For others, bi-weekly or even weekly dates may be possible, which is great. But you have to start somewhere, and you have to be intentional about it. Intentional about it. I'm sorry. And I promise you won't regret it. My third tip is to normalize saying, I'm not in the right headspace for this right now. This is something that I've been doing recently, and it's working wonders for me. I'm someone that's sort of obsessed with keeping a designated schedule, and if I'm unable to keep that schedule, I beat myself up and I feel super unorganized and thrown off. I realized, though, that this was costing me my wellness. I made the decision a long time ago that nothing is worth my wellness. Not any person, not school, not work or a job, not even this podcast or the wellness community that I've created, that I've spent really so much time creating. I want to really urge everyone to consciously make this decision and then intentionally start implementing this into their lives. And I'll give you all an example. So, I always schedule reading into my daily to-do list. I'm in a book club, and I also just enjoy reading a lot of informative nonfiction and things that I can learn from and take notes on. And as you can imagine, this does take a lot of mental energy. However, some days my day is just so busy and I can get a bit mentally or emotionally overwhelmed, and I just want to spend the rest of my day relaxing. Although I may have time in my day to read, when I try to, my mind just wanders elsewhere and I'm not focused on the task at hand. Knowing that I actually want to enjoy and pay attention to what I'm reading, I decided to take a step back and just come back to this activity later on. I've done this a couple of times, and when I do come back to the activity, whether it be later in the day or a couple of days later, I'm always grateful that I wasn't trying to just rush and get a chapter read or rush and get this homework assignment done, and that I actually took my time with it. The same thing usually happens when I'm trying to be ahead of the game and submit homework way earlier than it needs to be. Sometimes the assignment is too hard or it requires too much attention, much more attention than I'm willing to give in that present moment. There's absolutely no shame in deciding that you're not in the right spirit or the right mindset to handle a task or a certain situation. And being able to admit that to yourself and following through in securing your wellness is really one of the most ultimate forms of self-love. My fourth self-care tip is probably one that sounds a bit strange, but it is to focus on the wellness of others. Focusing on the well being of others and serving others as a whole is an underrated self care tip. When you genuinely focus on the well being of others, you fall out of that natural selfishness that we possess as humans. And you realize that supporting others has a positive effect on your own well being. This may sound surprising, but minding the well being of others improves not only their self esteem and their sense of belonging, but ours as well. It simultaneously helps us and others just feel good about ourselves. I feel that I'm always referencing Proverbs or Psalms, but they both just have such impactful scripture and precepts that I can't help myself. Proverbs chapter 11, verse 25, King James Version reads, "The liberal soul shall be made fat, and he that watereth shall be watered also himself." It's important to note about this particular self-care tip, though, that you shouldn't serve others with the intention of receiving a personal gain. You should do it out of sincerity. You have to consciously do it without expecting anything back. Otherwise, it's done in vain and it's purposeless. My fifth and final self-care tip is something that shouldn't come as a surprise if you know me, because this entire notion has really become a part of my identity, and that is setting boundaries. Creating boundaries in your life is something that is recurring and necessary as you continue to grow and heal. If you are not establishing boundaries and actually implementing them into your life, and I want to put an emphasis on that because as a former people pleaser, I know that this is a roadblock that many of us face before we ultimately give up on setting boundaries. If you are not doing this, you are not practicing self-care and you are not putting your wellness first. The fact is, your boundaries reflect how you feel about yourself. Personally, it's still very hard for me to be confident about the boundaries I establish and then actually implement them into my life. It may be the way I grew up, or it may be my strong desire to please everyone, or it may be the obsession I have with not being a quote-unquote problem starter, or it may be all of these things. But I often find myself apologizing, going back on my word, caving in, or just not even setting the boundary at all. It's definitely a process, and it doesn't happen overnight. It takes real practice to start seeing a change. I think that's why it's also so important for me to constantly remind people when referring to their wellness that boundaries are essential to a healthy, well lifestyle. Because I know firsthand the work it takes to reverse this non-boundary lifestyle and heal. That is all I have for today's episode of Peace Be Still with Katera Renae. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider leaving a review or sharing this episode and tagging me, or even consider leaving a tip. As always, all of my social media will be linked in this episode's description. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes, posts, and updates on Katera Renae Co. on Instagram. Peace, blessings, and prosperity to everyone.